All right, welcome to this episode of Photo Theology. I'm Doug, and today what we're going to be looking at is the Nikon D7000 going up against the Nikon D7100. Now, for frame of reference, what we're also going to do is we are going to have the Pentax K5 and we are also going to have the Nikon D4. Now, the reason why we have the other two cameras is to bring reference to the sensor setup that we're actually going to be looking at today. So, for those of you who have probably been shopping for an SLR, for those of you who have been looking at SLRs, you will notice that there has been two main sensors that manufacturers have pretty much been dealing with, minus, I want to say, Canon as a brand. 16 megapixel sensor, and you also have this 24 megapixel sensor that's basically fighting it out right now in the SLR arena. The 24 megapixel sensor was brought to light by Sony in a very economical and affordable way. I want to say about a year plus ago. That's what happened. It started off with the Sony A65, A77, and also even the Sony Nex 7. These cameras were a very interesting marketing ploy because although they are not full frame cameras in nature, meaning they don't use a full frame 35 millimeter sensor, their sensors were big enough and the megapixel count is strong enough that they could be passed off as full frame systems. So often when people talk to me and they want to talk to me about full frame, one of the things that will come out of my mouth is a Sony A65 or an A77, or if we're talking about like a compact size, SLR system, then I'll even mention, I want to say, the Nex 7. Now, what this has done is this has actually turned the SLR arena on its head in many respects, and Sony is a pioneer of SLR technology when it comes to actually driving the market. Like when they released their Alpha 100 and they had the 10 megapixel system, which did phenomenal, and it forced Nikon and Canon to raise themselves up to that level. This is a situation where it's no different. Nikon is now trying to adapt to the concept of a 24 megapixel system, and in the previous year what you had was you had the Nikon D7000, which actually uses a Sony 16 megapixel sensor. And that camera now is roughly, 2-ish years old. And it has done Nikon very well in terms of sales, in terms of presentation, and what have you not. But now Nikon, trying to keep up with the times, does not want to be outdone by Sony's 24 megapixel system, which is in their mid-range SLR and high-range SLR series. So Nikon has now come out with the D7100, which Nikon had other SLRs that had 24 megapixels. You had the 3200 and you also had the 5200. But the D7100 is a little different than those because when you're talking about the Sony system is a very robust system. You're talking about an autofocusing system of about a 0.14. You're also talking 10 frames a second in addition to the 24 megapixels. And you're talking about a video capability that at this point in time, if we're factoring in autofocus, can't be matched by anybody. When it comes to video, Sony is the best. That's the bottom line of that, and that's how I'm going to leave it for this conversation. But for Nikon, what they have done is they have gone to Toshiba to get a 24 megapixel sensor, specifically for the 5200 and for the D7000. And what we are going to look at here today is we are going to look at the native resolution and sensor output of the Nikon D7000 versus the D7100. Now, the reason why you have the Pentax K5 and the Nikon D4 at the bottom is to give reference to how the images ought to look in their native form. So part of this is development. Understand the Nikon D7000 is a first generation developed Sony sensor system. It's just a Nikon's body, and it's Nikon's name. The Pentax K5IIs that you're looking at there actually is a second generation developed system. The Nikon D7100 is using a first generation Toshiba system in terms of its sensor layout. And the Nikon D4 is using a 16 megapixel system, which this is Nikon's highest in unit. Now, imaging processor wise, the Nikon D7000 is actually using the Xpeed 3, which is the same imaging processor that's used in the Nikon D4. So that part's actually going to be very similar here. Now, right now what you're looking at is these images that were processed in Corel. They were then interpolated so that everything matches a 24 megapixel setup. That's what we have going on right now. So when you look at these, you might be thinking to yourself, well, wait a second here. Why is it that the 16 megapixel units, all three of them, meaning the 7000, the K5IIs, and the D4, why is it they all have the same resolution layout as the Nikon D7100? Well, it's simple. I interpolated them. That's what I did. So after processing the systems, their images that is, what I did is I interpolated to match resolution for resolution so you can see the true sharpness of the sensor. Also what I did in Corel though was I actually rebalanced the sensors. In other words, the dynamic range, I want to say the colors, the tones, everything is set to what the native sensor setup is designed for. So when you're looking at these images, understand that you do see a difference in them. And that difference that you see will be very, very important for the latter half of this video. When you're talking about sensor layout, it's important to understand that a sensor has to be designed to work on a multi-platform system. It's kind of like developing a video game, if you'd like to think of that. Okay, you have your console systems where you have the Wii, you have the Xbox 360, and then you have the PS3. And at some point you're going to have an Xbox One, you're going to have a PS3, and also you have the Wii U. When a video game is developed, and think of the sensor as the video game, that video game has to work properly if it wants to be sold, in the greatest mass, on multi-platforms. That's what it has to do. So it's kind of like your Call of Duty. You have Call of Duty for the Wii, you have Call of Duty for the Xbox, you have Call of Duty for the PS3. Well, when you're talking about sensor setup, in terms of the actual architecture, that architecture for the sensor actually has to work with multi-programs. One of the weaknesses that you actually have in the Nikon D7100 is that its sensor layout, and granted this is a very new sensor layout for Nikon, is not made for cross-platform processing. Meaning you just can't throw it into any old raw program and get the proper, or close to the proper colors, tones, dynamic range, and all of the above. Now, factoring in specifically on the 7000 and the 7100, dynamic range wise, for sure, it goes to the Nikon D7000. It is a older camera, but even though it's an older camera, it's also using a sensor, which is Sony sensor, which Nikon has had lots of experience with. Here with the Toshiba sensor that's in the D7100, you can see where the camera tends to struggle in terms of its dynamic range, in terms of its highlights and its shadows, and having that properly exposed the whole way through the image to give the most proper exposure possible. Also, you'll see between the two cameras the reds and also other colors. But I mean, simply put, the D7100 looks like a burgundy. I mean, that's exactly what it looks like. Now, this isn't the first camera that we've processed from Nikon that's had a color issue. And Nikons do tend to have color and tone issues. There are various reasons for this. but a lot of it just comes down to the nature of the beast here. But in what we're seeing, even at an ISO of 1600, you can definitely see where the D7000 does a much, much better job on its image processing than the D7100 does in terms of colors and tones and dynamic range. Now at the bottom there, you are going to see how the images should actually look when you look at the Pentax K5 IIs and when you look at the Nikon the D4. I'm not really going to get into those cameras that much. Like I said, they're just there for reference to, bring this, into perspective. Now keep in mind that price-wise, when we're talking about price, the Nikon the D7000, all right, is going to roughly run, for the sake of the conversation, we'll say about $1,300. The 7100 runs roughly about, for the sake of the conversation, we'll say $1,500 to $1,600. The Pentax, the K5 IIs, runs roughly, we'll say $1,100 to $1,200, and the Pentax, or I'm sorry, not the Pentax, but the Nikon the D4 is going to run $6,000 bucks. Okay, flat 6K. All right. So when you're looking at these images and when we're thinking about the perspective here, I want you guys to keep this in mind. Now, one of the reasons why Nikon, I believe, was willing to actually go to Toshiba to get the sensor is simply just due to the fact that the Toshiba sensor actually does very well in coordination with noise control in its native setup. So as you step into a 3200 ISO and we move forward, the 7100 is pretty much just going to drive the 7000 into the ground when it comes to ISO performance. The main things you want to look at are you want to look at the solid colors like your blacks, you want to look at your whites, and anything that's just solid in terms of color, including grays and whatnot, you're definitely going to see a difference there. Now, part of this comes down to how the manufacturer is able to use the sensor, and I want to say the imaging processor, along with the filtering systems, to actually manipulate the noise. And one thing that has to be pointed out here about the Nikon D7000 is that it has a low pass filter, but the D7100 does not have a low pass filter. And this is one of the reasons why the noise setup looks the way it does. So there's a new thing going on in cameras, and basically it's, does your camera have a low pass filter or does it not have a low pass filter? The idea behind the low pass filter is that it blurs light, and in doing that, what it does is it gets rid of any, how shall we say, artificial digitalized processes, such as, I want to say, jagged edges and stuff like that. That's the whole idea behind having a low pass filter, so that you get rid of those kind of things. All right, so the image looks less digital in the end. By subtracting out the low pass filter, where manufacturers are at in terms of technology right now, what they're actually able to do is they're able to bolster the resolution. In other words, they're able to allow the image to be sharper than what it normally would be, number one. So if you actually look at the sharpness between the 7000 and the 7100, in the native sensor setup, the 7000 is not as sharp as the 7100. The 7100 is actually a sharper unit. It is. But there is a flip side of this. And the flip side comes down to, I want to say, color correction, and it comes down to a couple of other things. Because remember, when you're building a camera system, you have to keep in mind that you're layering, processes on top of processes on top of processes in terms of implementation. So you've got filter 1, you've got sensor, then you got filter 2, and then you got whatever else they're throwing into the thing in order to make it work in the way that it's supposed to work. But when you take one of those out, that means you have to re-engineer the entire beast. That's what you have to do in order to make the beast work right, or in this case, in order to project the proper image. Now, between the 7000 and the 7100, What you're going to notice here, and this is, I want to say, very, very important at even the 12,000 ISO, is that the 7000 completely it loses out on noise control. There's no two ways about that. But the color system is so drastically different that you see there. And that's something that you got to decide between the two cameras in your comparison here of what we're actually looking at. Needless to say, the Pentax K5 and the Nikon the D4 definitely handle much better than either the 7000 or the 7100 when it comes to actual, noise control, and when it comes to dynamic range, and when it comes to image processing. And there's a reason for that. Now, I want you to keep in mind that the Sony sensor being used in the Pentax K5 is a second generation setup. So Nikon had a chance, or they had a choice, I guess you could say, where they could have went to Sony and said, listen, we're going to use your sensor a second time around, which is 16 megapixels, and we're going to just develop it that much further. Clearly, by the nature of the Nikon D4, Nikon would have stood a chance of producing a better quote-unquote product, if we would like to look at it from that perspective. But what I've also done in the second half of this video is I've actually taken something from DP Review. And my reasoning for taking something from DP Review was to show the cross-platform nature of sensor setups. So, what you're looking at right now, or basically it should be in the realm of what I'm talking about, is you're looking at the lens setup. And what we're going to look at are a number of, specific areas, key areas in the picture to actually see the sensor, set up, its coloring system, its dynamic range, so on and so forth. Now keep in mind, this is Adobe Raw, and what DP Review does is DP Review basically tries to set the Adobe Raw up where it's not remanaging the entire camera color system in order to process the proper image. However, the difference between Corel and Adobe is this. Adobe does not take the native sensor setup. That's not what they do. What Adobe does is Adobe actually takes the image in and then it reprocesses the image. Now, if you are looking at the Nikon D7100, you will notice that its colors are drastically different in this setup. And the reason why its colors are drastically different in this setup is due to the fact that Adobe has reprocessed the image. What you are also going to notice, though, is that the resolution, the sharpness, and the clarity that you had before in Corel, you actually lose in Adobe, or at least Adobe Raw. You actually lose these things. Now, the key thing you want to look at is you want to look at Mickey Mouse in this scenario, and you also want to look at the lady's face. Keep in mind, when you're looking at these images, for the lady's face, it's a camera taking a picture of a picture. So when you actually look at the image, you want to think to yourself, what looks like a camera taking a picture of a picture? Number one. Number two, what you want to look at is you want to look at the flesh tones, okay? In other words, when you're looking at the actual skin tone of the lady and of Mickey Mouse, first off, just go Google Mickey Mouse, you'll know what he looks like. But when you actually look at the tones of the lady, in terms of her skin tones and whatnot, the thing that you have to look at is, the vibrance. In terms of skin tones, are people's skin tones really that vibrant? The second thing you want to look at is you want to look at her eyebrows and stuff like that for noise, and I want to say artifacts and things like that. And the third thing you want to look at is how flush, as we move up in ISO, how flush is the performance of the skin tone. So that's what you want to look at there. Now, here we still use the 7000, the 7100, the K5 2S, And we also look at the, Nikon D4 as well. The other thing I would tell you to look at though is look at the dime. Okay, so you're going to see a quarter, or I want to say you're going to see a quarter of a picture of a dime, and when you actually look at that, look at how clean the metal is, because that's going to speak volumes to you as well. So as we look at this here, the important thing to understand about the 7000 is that the 7000 actually does, I want to say within the Nikon family, a very decent job if it's put into Adobe versus corrupt. Okay, especially when we look at higher ISOs and things like that. The second thing though that we have to point out is that the 7100 takes a step back in terms of noise control, in terms of clarity, and also it takes a step back in terms of the actual advantage of the 24 megapixel system. In order for Adobe to restructure the entire color system along with the dynamic range, and you can look at the metal and you see it right there. The 7000 is definitely on par, if not better, than the 7100. Now, other key things that you're going to want to think about when you think about these two cameras that I want to point out is autofocusing systems. Okay, to begin with, the 7000 is basically going to have about a 0.24 autofocusing system. Okay, or we'll average it out with a decent lens at around a 0.24. The 7100 uses the Nikon D300 system, which basically is going to average out at around a 0.23 in terms of autofocusing system. And the Nikon D4 is a 0.2. That's basically what it's going to average out at, is a 0.2. All right. Now this would be making the assumption that they're all using the same high-grade lens, and that's something that I do want to point out there when we're talking about autofocusing systems. Cross-focusing types. Okay, so the way with when you talk about Nikon, you can't just talk about center focus, but you also got to talk about your cross-focus. When it comes to cross-focusing, the speed of cross-focusing definitely takes a hit. Basically, it's just going to be slower. That's just all there is to it. But the thing you want to keep in mind here is that the Nikon, the D7000, has 9 cross-focusing types, where the 7100 and the Nikon, the D4, actually have 15 cross-focusing types. Now, depending on if you're really into cross-focusing or if you're not, I mean, that's entirely, your thing. When it comes to me, I could care less about cross-focusing. I'm not even going to lie about it. And the reason for that is I prefer autofocusing speed, and I prefer camera intelligence. So when you're talking about the actual autofocusing speed in conjunction with the camera's ability to shoot in low light, the Nikon D7000 has a minus exposure of 1 when it comes to autofocusing speed, where the Nikon D7000, the Nikon D7000 has an autofocusing of -1 when it comes to, and I'm talking exposure, when it comes to autofocusing speed. That's how low it can go, and it can still autofocus. The Nikon D7100 has a -2, and the Nikon D4 has a -2 as well. Now, the one thing I want to point out is the Pentax K5 II and 2S systems actually have a -3. And to me, that is way more impressive. Okay, so it's kind of self-defeating to be using high ISOs if you're shooting in low light, if your autofocusing system can't keep up with the low lit scenarios. And I'm talking about the ability for the camera just to be able to lock on. Quite often what happens is Nikons actually tend to hunt, and that's one of the bigger problems that they actually have. Now this also plays into the autofocusing speed. So when you're looking at a Nikon and you're saying, okay, you're at a 0.2 this and a 0.2 that, in conjunction with the Pentax, one of the reasons why I don't care about cross-focusing types, because the Pentax does have fewer cross-focusing types, which is true, but its autofocusing speed, instead of being at like a 0.2 whatever, like I just named a little bit ago, is less than a 0.1. Now think about that, okay? So with the Pentax, what you actually have is I can shoot one exposure lower, number one, and then number two, my autofocusing speed, no matter how we want to play this out, is more than twice as fast. Whether you want to take a $6,000 camera or a $1,400 camera, doesn't make a difference to me. If I'm going with the K5 II system or K5 IIS, then I'm still faster regardless. So I want to point that out there. Now, frames per second. Basically, with the Nikon D7000, it clocks in at 6 frames per second. No surprise, everybody should know that by now. Now, the Nikon D7100 has a very interesting system because it clocks in at 6 frames a second at 24 megapixels. Keep in mind, though, you have almost 50% greater megapixels being pumped through, that evaluation of the Xpeed 3 imaging processor versus the Xpeed 2 imaging processor that the 7000 had. Okay, so that Xpeed 3 really does help it out in terms of processing those megapixels and stuff like that. However, if you are willing to divert to a 15 megapixel setup, which as you get to these higher ISOs in terms of Adobe, you might be thinking 15 megapixels might not be so bad. Then you can actually start shooting at 7 frames a second. Now, why is this important? Well, because when Pentax came out with their K5 II, at the debut of the Nikon D7000, they were shooting at 7 when Nikon was shooting at 6. Okay, so this is another thing of trying to sweeten the deal for a person who wants a D7100 versus a D7000. But the last thing I'm going to mention is going to be this, okay? Adobe, look at the ISOs now, okay? And that's very important. Look at the ISOs and where they actually stay, okay, at the 12,000 mark. All right, the D7000 versus the D7100 and Adobe. You cannot escape it. The D7000 is better. It is. And the reason why I used DP Review for this is because a lot of people, they tend to sit up here and check out these camera reviews. And you know what the camera reviews consist of? They consist of, here I am with the camera out in the field. Man, I love the way it fits in my hand. Oh, dude, I love this menu system. Oh, man, look at how I took this picture. But what you never see is a comparison, or you almost never see, I should say, a comparison between like camera systems and predecessor versus the newcomer. You don't see those things. So you can't put the stuff in perspective. Well, here at Phototheology, we like to, put our stuff in perspective. And this is our perspective that we're going with right now. Anybody who's looking at a Nikon D7000, first off, I'm just going to throw it out there to you. From a photography standpoint, there are lots of options that you can go with. Anybody who's looking at a Nikon D7100, I don't even know what to tell you. This is one of those cases where there's a lot of potential. If you think back to the Corel scenario, there was a ton of potential in that Toshiba sensor. But when you start cranking up those ISOs and whatnot, you see the Nikon D7100 falling apart. And then when you compare it to the Pentax and you compare it to the Nikon D4 at the bottom, and then you factor in the pricing, it's just, it's crazy. That's what it is. Now, this is going to be important for another video that I'm going to be doing pretty soon here when I start talking about entry-level full-frame units and why they're relevant. But here's my advice. If you want to go Nikon and if you want to have a 24 megapixel system, then go buy yourself a D600. That's what you do. Okay, that is my advice to you. I would not buy a D7100 for anything. I don't even use Adobe Raw. Okay, I do use Corel sometimes. I prefer to use DxO, and I prefer to use Capture One. Those are my two programs that I personally like. But, Adobe is the status quo. But when you look at that image, my God, that image looks terrible at those higher ISOs, and there's no excuse for it. There simply isn't. But hey, in the end, it's your money and it's your choice. So with that being said, you guys take care, and I'll be doing a video later on with entry level full frame SLRs later. All right, bye-bye.